I'm going to talk about an experiment that's done with married couples in Uganda. So it's a lab in the field experiment. And we're testing the degree to which married couples listen to one another, okay? So we want to ask the question in this experiment, who processes information better? Who's closer to Bayesian reasoning when they're faced with new information? Is it individuals? Is it married couples? Or is it pairs of people, two people who are not married to each other? Okay. And I just wonder what you think about that. Now, the consensus would be something like that two heads are better than one. And although the literature on team decision-making, group decision-making is quite nuanced, the general message from that literature is that when you put two people together with a problem, they are better able to solve that problem when there's just one person alone. And those groups are typically put together for the purpose of the experiment. They're random strangers who are put together in a team. They have no ongoing relationship. But of course, in the real world, many groups are composed of people who have a long-term relationship. They know each other quite well. They're used to making decisions together. Okay, so are two heads better than one when the heads are actually married, right? Are married couples better than random pairings? Are they better than individuals? Are they better than random pairings? And sort of loosely, you might think that married couples might be better in this situation because when you're in a long-term relationship, you're used to exchanging information. You're used to making decisions. And maybe you don't hesitate in the way you might with a stranger when it comes to telling them that they're wrong. And of course, when you're in a couple, hopefully there's a sense of common purpose and trust between the members, okay, which creates a situation where it's easy to exchange information. On the other hand, if you're in a couple of some kind, a long-term relationship, there may be all sorts of deep emotions that are present in discussions within the relationship. And you may care more about the long-term relationship and not upsetting your partner than being actually right. Okay, so communication might be worse in married couples, at least for some things. So loosely, it's not clear, right, that the arguments that apply from the group's literature that two heads are better than one will be relevant when we're dealing with married couples. So why does this matter in a bigger sense is that actually the household, and within the household, the couple, is probably the most common and important decision-making unit in the world. Most adults across the world live with other adults. In some countries like Japan or the USA, the single-person household is the most common, but because there's two people in a two-person household, adults living with adults is the most common kind of common kind of family, right? And particularly in low-income countries, the efficiency of the household decision-making can be fundamental to survival and human flourishing, right? So the richer countries of the world, you don't need another person to survive economically. You can sell your labor in the job market and buy the goods you need. In some countries where the markets are less well developed and incomes are lower, the efficiency of the household is actually fundamental. We want to know whether households are efficient in this. So I'm going to use an earned problem, and I'll explain the details of the problem in a moment, to test the efficiency of information exchange in married couples. And by efficiency of information exchange, I'm going to examine whether spouse pairs, that's heterosexual married couples, married in some sense, it may be a traditional marriage, it may be a formal marriage, but married heterosexual couples make more Bayes rational decisions compared to individuals and non-spouse pairs. And I'm going to compare in two settings, one where they're sat together and can freely exchange views, and one where they're sat in different rooms and they must exchange messages in a very limited way, right? And one person in that situation has more information than the other. The participants for this experiment are drawn from this part of eastern Uganda on the slopes of Mount Elgon. And so this is a lab in the field experiment with kind of non-weird participants, which I think is important if we're going to understand how real people in the real world make decisions. Okay. So 4 literatures feed into this. It's a short presentation, so I'm not going to discuss them in any kind of detail, but obviously I've already mentioned economics experiments on groups, where the main message is 2 heads are better than 1. But there's now an emerging literature on intra-household decision-making, usually using common pool experiments. And the main message of that literature is that households are not particularly cooperative. Often couples fail to extract the full surplus from a public goods game, and they hide money from each other, they show a lack of trust, and so on. So there's good evidence that household decisions are not particularly efficient. And then there's other literatures on information processing in a social setting, where people often exhibit signs of conformity. In other words, they ignore some evidence in order to fit in with what other people are saying or doing. And a final literature from social psychology suggests that who we listen to when we go for advice matters. Matters whether they're older than us, whether they're male or female, and so on. So identity matters for advice taking. And each of these 4 literatures has some relevance to today's paper. Right, so let me get straight into the design. So in this experiment, there's going to be 36 tasks in all, in 6 sections, or 6 parts. And this particular task is at the heart of every problem, every stage of the experiment. And the experimental participants are asked to imagine that there are 2 possible bags, A and B, right? And each bag contains 5 balls. All the balls are either blue or yellow, and the probability of each bag is 0.5. The only difference between the bags is that A has 2 blue balls and B has only 1 blue ball. That's the only difference. And the task is to say which bag you think it is, whether it's A or B. And to help you in this experiment, the participants are given information about 4 balls in the bag, and that's 4 balls without replacement. Okay, so only 1 ball is a mystery. Now you may think that's quite an easy task in some situations, but in the real world, people are not trained in probability and sophisticated reasoning. So this is actually quite a difficult task for some people. But there are 3 possibilities, obviously, when you see the 4 balls. One is when there's 2 blue balls, one is when there's 1 blue ball, and one there's 0 blue balls. And obviously in the first case, that has to be bag A, because only bag A has 2 blue balls. And the last case has to be bag B, because bag A has 2 balls, and so you must find at least 1 blue ball when you draw 4 balls. So the only difficult problem, and I call this difficult, is the 1 blue ball case. And in that situation, the probability that the bag is A is 1/3. And the optimal guess in that situation is B. So for 2 situations, the optimal guess is B. And for 1 situation, the optimal guess is A. All right, so this task is runs through the experiment. And okay, now, so there are 6 parts to the experiment, 6 rounds in each part. And there are going to be 3 treatments, which I'll discuss in a moment. Now, I don't actually present people with the bags. Everything is done on paper. And they'll see a question like this. They're told, you see these 4 balls, and they're reminded of the 2 possibilities, A and B. You can see the 2 blue balls there, and they tick 1, right? And then we give feedback here about the result. Okay? And the results are obviously pre-assigned. We've got a list of what's correct in each situation. The 3 treatments differ as follows. Okay. In treatment 1, let's look at this table in the middle. The couples play as individuals to start with. They're separated and they're on their own. In treatment 2, the couples play as a couple. They sit together right from the start. And in treatment 3, there's a pair, and the pair are not married to each other. Right? Everybody, though, in the experiment is married to someone in the room. That's how the people in the experiment are recruited, because they're married. Right? But in treatment 3, you're playing with a partner who is not married to you. And that partner is drawn at random. So it could be a mixed sex couple. It could be a same sex couple. It's just someone you're not married to. And I'm randomizing at the level of the session, so everybody in the same session is facing the same treatment. And this is for management reasons. It's done mainly by pen and paper. And in part 2, we just flip treatments 1 and 2. So we're looking for order effects here. Couples are sitting together now in treatment 1, and in treatment 2, they're now playing as individuals, and in treatment 3, they're now playing as individuals. So we're comparing individual couple pair in the first round, and we're comparing couple and individual in the second round. So there's feedback after each task. All participants face the same task, and all the feedback is given silently. And out of the 6 tasks, 3 of the 6 tasks are going to be difficult. 3 of the 6 tasks are going to be straightforward. There's going to be, because there's 6 tasks and there's only 3 possibilities, there's going to be some mild reframing of some of the tasks. This is basically the same as this one. It just looks like the order of the balls is different, and people are paid for each correct answer. And if they get every answer correct through the experiment, it's about 3 days' wages for a 2-hour experiment. And people are paid individually for their work. Right. And we're drawing people from 20 villages. In each village, we randomly select 20 couples and invite them to an experiment. We run 2 sessions per day with different treatments in each session. And we keep the second session people away from the first session to avoid contamination. And we pre-match people before they get in the room so that we know who is matched to each other in treatment 3. Okay, instruction is in the local language, Lugisu, and we go through the usual pattern of pilots, training, we have posters and props and checks and understanding and so on. Okay, the location is a East Africa, rural area. It's an agriculture-based economy, but it's one that's changing quite rapidly. Most people earn income from cash crops as well as doing subsistence farming. Most people these days do some off-farm work, which provides some cash income. There are few sealed roads in this area, and most houses don't have electricity, but electricity is close in the villages and on the main roads. And most people have mobile phones, and they use mobile phones for banking and so on, okay? And there are purpose-built schools, which is where these experiments are all held. So they're all held at schools, and we take over the classrooms for a day. So let me get into the results for parts 1 and 2. I'm going to describe the methods for parts 3 to 6 later on, but parts 1 and 2 now. So what do you think? Is it individuals who are better at doing these decisions, couples, or is it pairs? Let's see. And this is the basic results. The grey bars are the mean number of correct judgments, the rational choices out of 6 for part 1. And the yellow bars are the part 2 mean answers, and it's out of 6. Maybe this scale is quite difficult to see. This goes from 3.4 to 4.6. And what you can see is that the pairs, the people who are not married to each other, are actually better than the married couples, right? So they're not necessarily strangers because they come from the same village, but they're not married to each other, and they're better at making these decisions very clearly than couples. And couples are better than individuals, which is a relief, I guess, if you're in a relationship, to know that you are better than an individual at making these decisions. So in a sense, this is the key result of the paper, one of the key results, that couples are better than individuals, but not as good as random pairs. And we have some tests on this slide, which is not so important, but this men are sort of weakly outperform women, although later on I show that this is largely due to the difference in education levels between the men and women. And the other thing that's going on is that when we compare couples to different types of pairs, like a man and a woman together, an all-male pair, an all-female pair, well, the power of this test is quite weak because the number of people in these groups is quite small. But it's generally the case that couples are worse than any kind of pair, right? So they're particularly worse than a mixed pair of a man and a woman. So couples, there's something about a couple that is not as productive as an unmarried pair, right? Part 2, the results are very, very similar. The female gap starts to diminish, women improve in part 2 compared to part 1, but otherwise these results are very, very similar. Okay. Now, just to go back for a second, one possibility here is you might think this is all due to assortative mating, maybe sort of well-educated people, married well-educated people, and so they don't learn anything from each other in this task. Right? But we do various tests, and there's no evidence that these results are driven by assortative mating. Right, so parts 3 to 6. Now in parts 3 to 6, the pairs are moved to separate rooms, and one person is going to make a recommendation for the choice, and the other person can ignore that recommendation or accept it. That other person is responsible for making the actual choice. Now, as well as that, one person will see a subset of the information seen by the other partner. Okay? So it's not that if they put the information together, they would have more information. One person is clearly better informed than the other. And specifically, one person continues to see 4 balls and one sees 2 balls, right, out of these 4. Okay? And 2 balls out of 4 is not very informative in this situation. Right? And they're told this is the case, they're warned about this case, and they go on to play all 4 possible roles. In other words, they play as a recommendation person and as a choosing person, and they play as a person who sees 4 balls and they sees 2 balls. And just to be very clear here, if everybody's bays and it's common knowledge is bays, that they are bays, then when you see 4 balls and you're doing the choosing, you should ignore the advice from the other person. And when you see 2 balls and you're doing the choosing, you should just obey what the other person recommends to you. Right. So that's the setup, separate rooms. It's manual. Okay. And let's get to the results. So this is the key slide from the second half of the experiment. And on the top, we've got the spouses and their results. And on the bottom, we've got the non-spouses. So let's look at the spouses for a second, right? And this is where the chooser sees 4 balls, and so they should ignore what the other person is telling them. So the key issue is whether they're choosing B in this situation or A, and they're mostly choosing B when there's 0 blue balls, which is correct, and they're mostly choosing A when there's 2 balls, but not completely, which is again correct. And the main issue, though, is whether they are sensitive to the advice. Are they listening to the person when they shouldn't be listening? And these little round circles are the significance levels for a test of whether the difference between the A and the B bars is significant. And what you can see is that the women are always sensitive to the advice from their husbands, right? So the difference between A and B is always significant. For men, though, when the choice is straightforward, they're not listening to what the wife is saying. When the choice is difficult, they are responding. And for non-spouses, right, there's fewer circles because basically they're not listening to the other person so much. They're much less responsive to the other person. Now, if you think about that, is that good or is it bad? Well, if you're the decision maker in this situation and you see 4 balls, you shouldn't be listening to the other person. So listening to the other person in general is harmful, and spouses are listening and non-spouses are not listening, right? All right. So let's go down to the other situation, right? Again, when there's just 2 balls, the spouses are listening to each other, and the non-spouses are listening to a lesser extent. All these differences are significant now. Most of these differences are not significant. Sorry, they're significant to a less degree. So spouses are listening much more than non-spouses. So the basic lesson is that spouses are listening more, which is harmful sometimes and productive in other times. And non-spouses are listening less, and that's harmful sometimes and no good in other situations. Right, so let's conclude. Parts 1 and 2, pairs are better than couples and individuals. In parts 3 to 6, women are much more likely to defer to men than vice versa, and spouses listen to each other much more than their non-spouses. And because of this, and because of those different situations, neither couples nor non-couples do better, right? So the takeaway, one takeaway from this is that if you split household decisions by expertise, then this may be good for efficiency, because then people wouldn't be listening to each other in situations when they shouldn't. Okay, so I think I'm out of time and I will stop at that point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. That was a great talk. So if anybody has any questions, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, so actually I have a question. So in some societies we see, especially patriarchal societies, we see usually the men taking charge of the decision making. So in that case, when you have a design like this, do you think, even though they're acting as a couple, is it possible that the man is just making the decision? They're not really acting together. So that what I mean is they're not acting as a couple, but pretty much as an individual unit. So do you think is there any way to separate that effect?
Right. So I mean that's a good question. And if you look in parts 1 and 2, what you can see is that the couples together, whether it's a pair or a married couple, are doing better than men alone. So there is some additional benefit from having another person with you, right? Now, what exactly that benefit is, I can't say, but it's not just the men dominating the conversation all the way through. Yeah. Right. And I should say, when they're separated, the women are not always obeying the men to a significant degree. And of course, in different societies, that might be very different, but in this part of Uganda, that's not a surprise to me, actually.
All right. Thank you. Any more questions? We can have one more question. All right. Then maybe we can move on to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Gaiden Fennick from University of Ottawa. And he's going to be presenting procrastination in teams. So Gaiden, if you could please share your screen.
So now, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay. So hello, I'm very excited to present this paper. Actually, this is the first time this paper is being presented. We are still in the process of collecting data. This is a joint work with Anujit Chakraborty from UC Davis. And because it's an ongoing project, all feedback is welcome. So let me start with the motivation. So we often decide to postpone unpleasant tasks only to postpone them again when the new set time arrives. So this is known as procrastination, and the problem with it is that it is often detrimental to our goals. And if you think about procrastinations, many of the tasks that are prone to procrastinations are done so far is about just individual environments. However, if you think about other type of tasks, which have to be also completed over time, rewards may not only depend on individual effort, they can also depend on group effort. So if you think about working on a joint paper or a joint project, this is usually work that is done in different stages. And at the end of the day, when the paper is published, all co-authors get an equal amount of the rewards. Then if you think about another environment in which people are also in groups, they are just competing for a job, they are applying for the same job. So all candidates have to also go through some stages, like interviews and other things. And at the end of the day, only one of them will get the job. So this is a different environment in which also the rewards are, do not only depend on individual effort. So basically the main research question of this paper is whether procrastination is identical across this individual environment and the group environments. So we consider two common interaction frameworks. The first one is a coordination framework, like the example of the paper, of the joint paper. The second one is just competition, when people are applying for the same job. An additional question, and this comes from the individual environment, in which subjects can use a commitment device to push their future self into work. The natural question here is whether the demand for this commitment will change when now people interact with each other. So this is kind of the second question we want to answer, but the main one is whether effort or procrastination will change when you just group people. So let me just jump to the experimental design. I'm doing this just because then the model will be easier to understand. It's just a straightforward model. But let me just show you the design. So in the solo treatment, which we call baseline, subjects just have to exert some effort in 3 consecutive days. So they just have to log in, submit some tasks, and then these tasks are added up and they receive a piece rate. In this case, P is equal to $0.015. So it's just straightforward. So they receive the piece rate for the task they complete. The only constraint here is that they only have 45 minutes. So they have to allocate this time among these 3 days. And then they also get what we call a login bonus. So they get this bonus just by logging in each of the days and completing a minimum amount of tasks. And actually this minimum amount of tasks, this is set by the participants. So if participants want to commit their future self, they can just enter a high number there. So they are forced to come back the next days and exert some work. They don't want to commit, the minimum they can set is 5. So to be eligible for this bonus, they have to complete at least 5 tasks per day. And you'll notice that this is very easy to achieve. The tasks are not too complicated. In the coordination treatment, now subjects have to submit the same tasks, but now they are paired with another subject. So here I have subject I and subject J. The only difference here is at the end of the day, we add up the task they submit in each day, each one of them, and we just pay them based on the average. So that's why this is coordination, because you really have to coordinate with your partner somehow to achieve a higher payment. And here you also get the login bonus if you complete the minimum amount of tasks. We have some sub-treatments in which, in some of them, subjects do not observe what their partner did in the previous days. Some other treatments, they observe what the partner did. And then we have also a competition treatment. This is a bit different because, again, subjects are paired with another subject. They get some piece rate. Now it's 2/3 of P for their own effort. And only the subject that completes the highest amount of tasks gets an additional piece rate of 1/3 of P. So here subjects are motivated to beat their partner. And they also get this login bonus the same way as before. And we also have observability and non-observability. So let me just talk briefly about the literature. I won't spend too much time on this because this experiment is related to many literatures. So in general, this is related to, of course, effort tasks in the lab. There is a very nice survey by Charnes and authors in which different effort tasks in the labs are compared. This is also related to piece rate versus tournaments, especially our competition treatment. We will be comparing the solo environment versus a competition. Of course, this is also related to intertemporal choices, especially the ones in which subjects have to allocate effort over time. Not that much about the allocation in monetary terms. However, all of these experiments have been done on an individual context. This is also related to demand for commitment and finally coordination. There is a paper about a weekly experiment with real effort tasks. Let me show you the model. Just briefly, I just have one slide and I will jump to the predictions of the model just immediately. So in this theoretical model, subjects exert effort for 3 consecutive days. In day 1, subject I solves a standard maximization problem, just assuming beta delta preferences. So they have to maximize the piece rate times the effort they exert in each of the days. And there is some cost associated with exerting effort. It's discounted according to the day in which you exert the effort. And the effort is, of course, subject to a constraint because you only have 45 minutes. So of course, it depends also on your average speed, the maximum number of tasks you can complete. T here is just the payment day minus day 1. We pay subjects 2 days after the experiment is completed. And P is the piece rate that I showed you before. C is just a cost function in which gamma and K are estimated in the experiment. We just run some additional tasks to estimate these 2 parameters. And I already showed you how this problem will change in coordination and competition. And the problem is just solved recursively starting from day 3. So this is very standard. So let me just jump to the predictions of this model. So the first prediction is for present bias subjects. So the prediction here is that subjects that spend the 45 minutes, this context, and are present bias, they will allocate a higher proportion of effort in day 1. So you can take this E tilde 1. So this is just the proportion of the tasks that are completed in day 1. And this should be the same for all treatments with no observability, for the individual treatment and competition with no observability and coordination with no observability. This is something we are going to test. Also, treatments that lead to a higher effort would lead to also higher commitment. This is also a prediction of the model. If we compare solo and coordination, subjects in the solo treatment should exert more effort than in coordination treatment because just incentives to free ride in coordination treatment, they are just getting half of the piece rate in coordination. If you think about the competition treatment, now the effort compared to solo will depend on whether subjects are optimistic, on whether they can beat their partners or not. If they are optimistic, they should exert more effort because that will guarantee that they would win. If they are pessimistic and they think that their partner will win for sure, then they will exert less effort. In competition, finally, in competition, observability will influence beliefs. So if you, at some point of the experiment, you observe that your partner is doing worse than you update your beliefs and now you exert more effort because you become optimistic. Otherwise, you become pessimistic and you exert less effort. And in general, observability should just increase the gap between your own effort and the effort of your partner. So how do we implement this experiment? So this is run in mTorque. We're still collecting the data, so we have recruited some subjects in May and June. Our target would be to get 150 subjects in the baseline treatment, coordination and competition. So we'll have 75 subjects with no visibility and 75 subjects with visibility. So we are not still there. So some of the results I will show you are just preliminary. We think that the results go in the right direction, but we still have to get more statistical power. So this seems like a straightforward experiment. However, we ran some pilots. Instructions were not too clear for subjects. So we decided to include a quiz before the experiment started. And this is a very simple quiz. This is about the instructions and incentives. And only the people that get most of the questions correct are able to participate in the experiment. On day one, subjects have to choose a minimum level of effort that they want to exert. This is a commitment. The only constraint here is that this should be at least 5 tasks. So they can choose whatever number they want. On days 1, 2, and 3, they have to provide a plan of how many tasks they are thinking they believe they can complete. We elicit risk preferences, and subjects receive their pay of 2 days after the experiment is completed. The average payment was $10. So this is not too bad for mTORC. Actually, some of the participants were very happy with this kind of outcomes, because you'll notice that the task itself is very simple. So let me show you the computer interface. This was programmed in O3. So this is the first thing, sorry. The first thing they have to do is just to set the minimum. As I mentioned, this should be at least 5. In treatments in which they are paired with other subjects, they cannot see the minimum chosen by the other subject. They can only know their own minimum. And then this is the planning page. So here, this has a dual function. So the first thing is for subjects to understand a bit more how they are going to be paid. So this is for the coordination treatment. This is an example. So first they have to guess how many tasks the other player is going to complete. And then they have to set just a plan for them. In this case, this subject wants to complete 100 tasks in day 1, 200 in day 2, and 300 in day 3. And given that their payment will depend on the other player as well, they have to guess how many tasks the other player is going to complete. Then when they click calculate, the computer shows the payment for both players. And they can change this number as many times as they want. At the end, they have to submit just one single plan. And this is just the actual task. So it's just, the task is just based on typing this random sequence of letters. So it's very simple. And at the beginning, it's even fun. After doing it like for 20 times, it starts to be a little bit boring, but it's really doable. They have up to 45 minutes, so the clock is displayed in the middle, and they are also reminded about their plan and the minimum task that they set. Okay, so just in time, so let me show you the results. So let me start with percent bias. So the proportion of tasks that they complete in term 1 as a proportion of the total tasks. So the prediction of the model is that this proportion should be the same in each of the treatments, at least the observability treatments, sorry, the no observability treatments. And here I'm comparing the coordination treatment and the competition treatment, and I'm displaying the average of this proportion. And in the competition treatment, this proportion is much higher. So close to 40% of the tasks are completed in day 1. And this is statistically significant. I'm not including here the solo treatment, which I should have, but we don't have enough statistical power. So that's why I'm not showing you the data. We are in the process of collecting more data. If I just take all treatments, you see that this average is different in all these treatments. Actually, I run an ANOVA test for all these treatments, and the null hypothesis of equal means is rejected. And so this is just how this should look like when we collect more data. But here actually, I shouldn't include the observability treatments because the prediction is only in the non-observability treatments. In terms of effort, here I'm showing you just a CDF, some CDFs of the number of tasks. Here clearly you can see that subjects in the coordination and competition treatments exert more effort than in the solo one. The surprising thing about this is that subjects in the solo treatment exert less effort than in coordination. We expected the opposite, just because subjects in coordination have some incentives to feel right. And actually these distributions are statistically different. We ran some tests. Also in terms of time spent, so only above 30% of subjects spend the full time, the full 45 minutes in the solo treatment versus 55% in coordination and competition. And so they exert more effort in group treatments and they spend more time also in group treatments. They are more engaged in general. And let me just show you commitment. So in terms of commitment here, I'm just showing you a histogram of the minimum number of tasks. I will start with the baseline. 5 is the minimum they can set. So if they really want to be fully flexible, they should select 5 because in that case, they just don't commit. Like completing 5 tasks, it takes you like probably 1 minute of your day. So let me show you the proportion of people that chooses 5 there, and then some other higher amounts. So in the solo treatment, close to 30% of subjects choose this minimum level. And some other participants, they choose 10, which is just double, and it's not a lot. So close to 40%. And let me compare that to coordination. In coordination, you can see that only half of subjects choose 5. And there are subjects that choose even high numbers, so even higher than, more tasks than 100, so that's a lot. It's also very similar for competition. Subjects in the competition treatments, they commit a lot. They commit much more than in the solo treatment. And let me finish with one more slide about visibility. So unfortunately, I don't have time to show you all the results because we also collected data on the plans, but let me show you about the role of visibility. So in this case, we really need to collect more data. But the prediction here is that by allowing observability of your partner, you should increase the gap between your own effort and the effort of your partner, but we don't observe that. However, as I mentioned, we don't have statistical power to prove this. So I think I only have 1 minute left, so let me just conclude. So this paper shows how the allocation of effort over time changes when payments depend on a group effort rather than individual effort. This is probably the main result. So present bias is sensitive to the environment, although we still have to collect more data to support this finding. Demand for commitment and something that I didn't show you, the plans are actually proportional to actual effort. So treatments which will demand more effort, people will actually increase their commitment and the plans will also reflect a higher effort. And something that we find surprising is that in the coordination treatment, in which there are incentives to feel right, we don't observe a lower effort than in the solo treatment. So thank you. And I'm not sure if you have questions.
Thank you, Gaiden. That was a very interesting talk. Procrastination is something probably a lot of us struggle with. So it's great to know it's group effects. So anybody, if you all have any questions, please unmute yourself. You can ask the question now.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was just wondering whether you see that people are faster at doing it when they get into the flow of it. So on a certain day, when they start solving these tasks, like when they start typing in the words, do they get better as they go, as they solve more of these tasks? So, maybe that could explain why, if you do see something like that, maybe that could explain why people commit to doing more in these competition treatments, or they want to do more in the competition treatments because they think that if I do a lot on the first day, maybe I'll get better at it and I'll be able to do a lot more compared to, if I space it out, then maybe on the second and third day, I don't get into the flow of it as well as I do on the first day. And so I am not as good at it in the second and third as I will be on the first day. I hope I make sense.
Yes, yes, that's a very interesting question. Actually, we collected that data, so we can see how many tasks they complete in each of the minutes. And as far as I remember, I don't have the figures here, but this is flat. So it doesn't change it a lot. I was expecting to see a decrease over time because you get tired. But you are right, probably we should compare it across days and see if they initially they want to complete more and actually they are faster and then they decrease. And you are right also in the sense that there is a lot of uncertainty before starting the experiment. Actually, if you look at the plans, they actually overestimate the amount of effort that it will take. So the plans are very conservative and most of the subjects just exceed this number. Of course, the plans are not binding, but they are also not very informative because they just think that they will not have time to complete it. And at the end of the day, they notice that the task is not too hard. So they do more, they exert more effort. But I think we should do whatever the idea that you are suggesting. That's interesting.
Okay, thanks a lot. And very interesting paper. Thanks.
Thank you.
We can have one more question. We have 1 more minute. So if anybody else has a question. All right. In that case, we'll move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Manisa Lepper from University of Pittsburgh, and she's going to talk about claiming credit, gender, memory, and social norms.
Hey, so this is joint work with Jonas Miller-Gastel, who's at Stanford, and Stephanie Wang, who's also at the University of Pittsburgh. And our paper investigates how people claim credit when they're working in teams. So we look at what mechanisms could influence this and treatments to try to de-bias it to get people to report their credit in a more accurate manner. And we investigate if these biases impact women differently. So there's a few policy implications of this paper. Group work is something that happens in a lot of different jobs. And it's important for hiring decisions, promotion decisions, and salary to be able to identify how much individuals actually contributed to the group work. So if, for example, in tech companies, when they interview people, a common question that's asked is, tell me about a project you worked on and how much you contributed to it. Or in law firms, every year they have, a lot of law firms have their associates say what deals they worked on and how much credit they gave. So it's important for these decisions to be able to accurately tell how much self-assessment actually works in figuring out how much credit someone deserves. So to test this, I'll talk more about the tasks in a minute, but we use tasks that have objective true answers that groups are paid based off of, but there's more subjective level of contributing to reaching these true answers and to helping your group along. And we ran a few treatments that looked at the impact of motivated recall. So we had treatments where they're asked to say their contribution a few days after to see if motivated recall will help people or will make people overclaim more. We also had private versus public treatments where, even though this was a dynamic game, people's credit contributions for both themselves and their teammates were shown. And so to test how social norms impacted it. And we also looked at if the gender domain influenced overclaiming, since if women in male-dominated fields were less likely to claim credit, this may influence the gender wage gap. So the first paradigm I'm going to talk about, we call it the Stumper paradigm. So in this, people worked on groups in riddles. So we went on MTurk and we had workers that were matched into groups of 3. And I'll talk about this in a second, but they knew everyone's gender. They discussed a riddle in the chat, and then one answer from their group was selected to be paid for the whole group. So they all had an incentive to make sure to actually discuss it, make sure everyone in the group came to the same conclusion. They're then asked to allocate 100% of credit between them and the other 2 members in their group, which was incentive compatible, since we had MTurkers who would read the chat transcripts, and we had them allocate credit as well. So we used the binary scoring rule to pay the participants who worked on the chat for their contribution. And like I said, we had some different treatments. So in the public condition, the claims was shown immediately after to everyone in their group. And in the memory condition, there was a 4-day delay. So we kept the monetary incentives the same in both of these conditions. Your incentive was to be as accurate as possible with your claims, but we just changed in the public condition whether or not people would be seeing it. So to get the gender without leading to experimental demand effects, we had them in the start of the experiment fill out a short survey where they're asked their gender, their favorite music genre, and their favorite color. And then when they're matched into groups, they're shown all this information and they're given a gendered nickname that was shown in gender congruent colors. So pink for girls and blue for boys. And then they're given a riddle. And so we chose riddles because there's one correct answer, but it's not necessarily immediately apparent. But once it is, everyone understands it. So they could discuss it in a group. And like I said, they all submit one answer. So this is an example of one of the riddles. There's 3 different types. Okay, so the first thing I want to show is the fact that there is overclaiming across the board. So this is across our full sample. They on average claimed about 15 percentage points higher credit than they were assigned by MTurkers, who assigned about a third to each person. And this holds true, but is attenuated when we look at just the subsample that got the correct answer. So the reason we're looking at this is it's hard to say how much credit you get for something that's incorrect. So if you submit an incorrect answer, you shouldn't, you're not able to get credit for that. You didn't help your group. So if we just look at this, it attenuates it. The overclaiming, that's mostly because they're being assigned more credit by the MTurk raters rather than overclaiming more. So they claimed about the same as the people got it incorrect, but they were accurately rewarded by the MTurkers. So now to break it up into treatments, our kind of control treatment was this no delay private. And so this is the same where we see the overclaiming, but there's not really a gender result. When we compare it to when there's the recall delay, this is not significant. There's no change. So it looks like asking them to recall it a few days later doesn't actually increase the inaccuracy. So they are just still overclaiming across the board. However, when we look at the public, this significantly reduces the overclaiming. And so the point is, this is a dynamic game. They're not going to be interacting with their group mates ever again. They're just being shown what their group mates said to them, and they know going into it that their claims are going to be shown to their group mates, but this significantly reduces the amount of overclaiming. So this is suggestive evidence that social norms do influence it. So However, across all of these treatments, there's not any gender difference. So the top histogram shows the distribution of the scores that individuals assign to themselves, and there's no difference between men and women. Well, the bottom shows the distribution of scores that the M-Turkers assigned. And again, there's no difference between men and women. They're just in general, people are assigning themselves a much higher score than they're assigning their group mates. And I don't have this in here, but we tested and we looked at the scores people gave themselves compared to the scores their group mates gave them. And in general, the group mates scores were very similar to the scores that the M-Turkers did. So even when we do econometric techniques, there's just no gender difference in there. So to test this, we added, a summary of the main results is in this riddles treatment, we don't see any gender differences, but we do see the fact that the public reporting is a way to debias this overclaiming. So to further test these gender differences, we added a second paradigm, which was in a more male type task of summing squares. And so we are still collecting data for this, so this is slightly underpowered. So in this one, participants were in groups of 3. This was done in the lab, and they were asked to add up numbers in a square. These numbers were from 1 to 3 on either side of 0, so you could start crossing them out. One of the 3 people in the group was the active player, and they had the chance to submit an answer, and if it was correct, their whole group got paid for that. When you weren't the active player, you were a reserve player, so you could see the square that the active player was working on, you could see their gender nickname, and you could see how they answered the last question, and you could vote to skip them. If both reserve players voted to skip, the active player lost their turn, and the reserve players were able to solve the square, and then it continued on. So this task was more in a male type domain, and it still had some subjective way to do it, looking at if people could say like, oh, I skipped this person who was taking really slow, so that means I contributed more, or I was able to solve these really fast, and that was better even though I missed some. So there's still some subjective component to it, but there's still the objective component of they're just paid for the amount of squares they did. So we also had M-Turkers who provided their ratings, and it looked like the M-Turk raters pretty much just cared about the percent of the group total that was solved. So in looking at this, there's still overclaiming across the board, slightly less so. It was about 10 percentage points compared to the 15 percentage points in the riddles. And however, there is suggestive evidence. I'll show you the Tobit in a minute, but that women are claiming less credit. So they're still overclaiming, but they're overclaiming less so than men. So they're performing slightly worse, but they're still even conditional on the fact that they're taking slightly longer and solving a few more words, they still are underclaiming. So this is the Tobit results, and it is marginally significant, but like I said, this is underpowered, so we're hoping to run more sessions and get the sample up to 250 because this is slightly noisy. So conclusion, the main thing is we find this robust overclaiming. So I didn't show this today, but is moderated by overconfidence and risk aversion, but even conditional on all of those, there still is an overclaiming that's not being explained by this. This seems to be mediated by or attenuated when there's a public condition, and there's only really evidence for gender differences when it's in a male type domain. So our hopes, once we're able to collect more data, is the fact that we could get more power in our male type task, run treatments like to see if the public decision also influences it in the male type task, and then also run treatments looking at what happens if their claiming credit actually influences other decisions. So run a second stage where you could get hired or not hired based off of your credit claims to see if in a more dynamic setting, there's this overclaiming is more. So that's I have today. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'm happy to hear it. So this is still a work in progress, so any feedback is very welcome.
Thank you, Marissa. So yes, we do have a few minutes. So anybody, if you all have any questions, please go ahead and ask now.
I have just a quick question. Are all these participants based in the US? Because I can imagine in different cultures, people have a different way of saying whether they are responsible for the work. I mean, in Japan, you're probably trying to avoid overclaiming in a situation. You'd use some kind of humble brag to you know, show what you did.
That's a really good question. So we did restrict all of our sample to the US. On the MTurk, we used qualifications to make sure they're US based. And the math task was run in the Peel lab. So they're all at least living in the US. But that's a good point that there could be cultural, especially in terms of the social norms. If you live in a society where it looks bad to be overclaiming and bragging about yourself, that would definitely influence it. So that is something maybe in the future treatments we could ask people where they came from. It's just because they're living in the US doesn't mean they're necessarily from America.
Thank you.
A good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, I have one more question, Marissa. So I probably missed this, but is the bragging related to the performance? I don't know if you showed this in the result, I probably missed it. So my point is, like, is it like some people who perform better than the others, they are bragging more, or they're overclaiming it? So
yeah, so I didn't show this, I probably should have, but it's actually mostly being led by the people who perform poorly. So there's an interaction with your performance, and the people who perform well are overclaiming by just slightly a bit, and it's the people who perform poorly who are pretty much saying that they deserve just as much credit as the people who performed well. So we did that in terms, it holds true in both tasks. In terms of the math task, like people who solve less sums say they deserve usually about like a third of the credit, and in the riddle task in terms of that. So something we're going to be doing next is looking at like textual analysis to see if people who like talk more, even though they're not really saying anything, think they should claim credit. But in general, the people who are being assigned less credit are the ones who are overclaiming more.
Right.
But that's a good question. I should have included that.
Thank you.
Marissa, I have a very interesting talk. I have a quick question about the riddles part. You went over this quickly, but the case where the group credit was being assigned by others. I'm trying to think in my mind, relate this to recent evidence that men and women are receive different credit for joint work, like co-authorship and so forth. What did the raters, what information did they have? Did they have access to the chats leading up to the group's decision?
Yeah, so they had access to the chats. So I have, we ran one treatment, I'll share this, where they knew the gender and one where they didn't. And knowing the gender when you're a rater actually didn't influence the decision at the rating at all. So what they had access to is depending on the treatment, if they knew the gender or not, but then they just had the chat and they would read through the chat, and they also had the answer that they submitted. And we looked at also the claims given by teammates, because the teammates knew the gender, and there wasn't any impact of teammates rating people based off of their gender.
Interesting, thanks.
Marissa, can I just follow up on that? Because I wonder if the raters had access to the musical preferences as well. And I'm wondering whether the musical preferences in the US provide some kind of signal of race, and people might judge you also on the basis of that.
That's a good point. So the raters did not have access to the musical preferences. Obviously the teammates did. So we could look into that and categorize the musical preferences and see if that influenced the ratings at all. That look into.
Any more questions? All right, in that case, I'll share my screen.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Can everybody see my screen? All right. So so the title of my paper is First Belong, Then Lead, Role of Group Identity in Leadership Effectiveness. I am a PhD student in the Department of Economics, John Mason University, and I'm co-authoring this paper with my advisor, Dr. Daniel Hauser. So I'm still working on this paper, so any feedback will be really appreciated. All right. Okay. Yes. So leadership is very important for mitigating cooperation failures, especially in collective action problems, because in collective action problems, each person has faces a conflict between the personal interests and the collective interest of the group. A leader is effective if the leader can ensure cooperation within the teams and make sure that each participant chooses the collective interest over the personal interest. And when there's greater diversity in leadership, we see it enhances innovation and productivity. It reduces the adverse effects of group thinking. So there's a report by McKinsey and Company, which came out in 2014, and it showed that companies which had greater gender diversity in the executive teams experienced, so they're 15% more likely to experience above average profitability. And when they redid the analysis in 2018, they found that the number rose to 21%. So greater gender diversity means better performance of the firms. Along with these benefits, diverse leaders also serve as role models for the followers. So this is something that came out recently in news. Most of you must have seen this, that female heads of state were thought to better handle the COVID-19 crisis than male leaders. I mean, obviously, the COVID-19 crisis is an ever-changing situation, so there are conflicting opinions about this. But the key takeaway from this news is when there is a female leader, it sends a signal that people from diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives can someday reach that position of leadership. So that is what I mean by saying that diverse leaders are role models for the followers. But despite so many benefits of a diverse and inclusive environment, we often see that many outsiders face resistance in leadership roles. So why is that? We hypothesize that in-group bias has a role to play here. So very simply, in-group bias is when you're favoring somebody from your own group and discriminating against somebody who does not belong to your group. So there's a social identity theory which says that leaders are more effective in influencing followers when they're perceived as prototypical of the group. So followers are going to believe that these in-group leaders have the best interest of the group in mind. So they're going to trust these leaders much more, okay? And they're going to cooperate with these leaders. But the flip side of that means that when these followers will have an outsider leading them, an outgroup leader, they will not trust these leaders as much. They're not going to cooperate with these leaders, no matter what the credentials of that outgroup leader is. So this leads to lower performance by the group. It also makes these outgroup leaders less effective than they could be. Okay, so that is what our research question is. We designed an experiment to see does in-group bias in a leader-follower framework pose a challenge for effective leadership? So there are a bunch of papers which look at the effects of group identity. So these papers like Eckel and Grossman and Shen and Lee, these are some of the first papers which look at in-group favorism and see how it works. There are a bunch of papers on outgroup discrimination also. Most of the papers that I mentioned here are experiment papers. I'm not going over them in details because I don't think I'll have the time. But I'd love to talk about them later on, maybe. Okay, so coming to our experimental design, we divided our design into two parts. In the first part, we first build the social identities. And in the second part, we see the effect of the social identities on group behavior. We do not use natural social identities. We artificially induce the group identities in the lab. Because we want to see whether even the minimal conditions for building group identity can have an effect on group behavior and leader effectiveness. All right. So for our first part, we use a mechanism similar to Pannenhauser 2013. We use a twofold identification strategy. So that means we first assign labels to the group. So red square, yellow rectangle, purple rectangle, and blue square. And in the second part, we ask the groups to collectively solve a puzzle task. Okay, and this is what we hope will build the affinity of the group members towards each other. And in order to encourage intergroup competition, we also incentivize the task. So the group which finishes the task first gets an additional $2. All right. So basically the task for each group is to complete 4 identical shapes. So for example, the red square group's task is to complete 4 identical red squares. The yellow rectangle group's task is to complete 4 identical yellow rectangles, and so on. So this is the puzzle task for the red square group. So if they put these 4 puzzle pieces together, then they have this complete square. And if they make 4 of these complete squares, then they finish the task. All right. So each group member is given an envelope with a few puzzle tasks. One thing to note here is that no one person will be given these 4 pieces to make a complete square. So every group member has to exchange the puzzle pieces with each other, talk and interact with each other in order to successfully complete the task. We do this because we think that interacting with each other and talking with each other will strengthen the group identity between the group members. So that's why we do that. And one more thing is that all these puzzles, the squares and the rectangles, they're all cut at exactly the same points, so that there's no difficulty level in solving the puzzles for any of the groups. All right, so that's part 1. In the second part, we use a repeated public goods game and a mechanism similar to House-Renault 2014. So we introduce our treatments in this part of the experiment, and each treatment is a variant of the standard linear public goods game. So each individual gets a $10 experimental dollar endowment, which they have to allocate between the individual account and the group account. There are 20 rounds in total. And for this part, we have 4 new groups. Okay, so so the groups that played the puzzle games, they're no longer playing together. These are 4 new groups, and each group has 4 members. All right. So this is our first treatment, the no leader treatment. This is our baseline. So this is a very simple standard linear public goods game. So each group just plays the public goods game among themselves. There are no leaders, no followers here. So just simply public goods game. Okay. In our next treatment, the in-group leader treatment, this is where we introduce our leaders. So at the very beginning of the public goods game, one leader is randomly selected from each group. One subject is randomly selected as a leader in each group, and this person remains the leader throughout the game. All right. The leader's job is to send a non-binding contribution suggestion to all the group members. So the leader sends a message like, let us contribute $7 to the group account. Okay. So once the followers receive this message, they see the message and they decide whether they want to follow the advice of the leader or not. And then the leader and the follower simultaneously, they make their contribution decisions. All right. So that's the leader's job here. The roles and group identity of all the subjects are common information, at least within the group. So within the group, each person knows the other's role and their group identity. The thing about the in-group leader treatment is that the leader is from the same group. All right. So here, if you see, these followers are from the red square group, and the leader is also from the red square group. So by that, I mean, these followers have already interacted with the leader when they were solving the puzzle tasks together. So even though these are new groups, when they started to play the public goods game, they realized that the leader was from the same group as they had previously when they were solving the puzzle task. So that is what we mean by the leader being from the same group, or the leader being an in-group member. Okay, so that's the in-group treatment. In the next treatment, the out-group leader treatment, the only difference is that the leader is now from a different group. So the followers, they are still from this, they still share the same group identity. It's only that the leader is now from a different group. So the red square group followers have a purple rectangle leader. Okay, so the followers now know that the leader that they have, they did not play the puzzle game with. So that's why we say the leader is from a different group, or the leader is an out-group member. But everything else pretty much remains the same. The leaders still send a non-binding contribution suggestion to all the group members, post which the leaders and the followers, they simultaneously make their contribution decisions. So that's our design. A few details on the experimental procedures. So there were 10 sessions in total for all the treatments. The data was collected in 2019. It was collected, so I ran the experiments in George Mason University's experimental lab with an undergrad population. The exchange rate was 2 experimental dollars equals to $1 US, and I paid for a random round. The average earnings were about $13.83 with $5 given for showing up on time. Okay, so coming to our hypothesis, we have 4 main hypotheses. So when group identity is salient among group members, in-group leaders will be more effective in fostering cooperation than out-group leaders. So this addresses the main research question of a paper of whether in-group bias poses a challenge for effective leadership. So if the followers do not have any favoritism-based preferences, then they will be equally interested in the contribution suggestion made by an in-group leader and an out-group leader. But if the shared group identity between a leader and her followers is strong, then we predict that these followers are going to discriminate against the out-group leaders, making them less effective. Our second hypothesis is followers of leaders in group and out-group who advocate cooperation will exhibit more cooperation than group members without a leader. So here we really want to see whether there is any positive effect of having a leader at all, or there's no reason for having a leader. So that's what we want to see here. The third hypothesis, contribution suggestions made by in-group leaders are followed more closely by group members than contribution suggestions made by out-group leaders. So this is another measure of leader effectiveness. Here, what we want to see is whether there is any difference in the deviations from the contribution suggestions made by in-group and out-group leaders. And finally, we also want to see whether in-group bias is only exhibited by the followers, or leaders also exhibit in-group bias. And if that is so, then we predict that in-group leaders will be more committed to fostering cooperation than out-group leaders. So we had 160 subjects in total for all the treatments. We had 32 subjects in the no leader treatment, which is our baseline. And then we had 64 subjects each in the in-group leader treatment and the out-group leader treatment, which we divide into 16 leaders and 48 followers in both the in-group leader and out-group leader treatment. All right. So coming to results, our first result is contribution to the public good. So here we have rounds, number of rounds on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have mean contribution. So the blue line shows the mean contributions made to the group account under in-group leadership. The red line shows the mean contribution under out-group leadership, and the green one is under no leadership, or the baseline, where we don't have a leader. So as it is very visible, there is a statistically significant difference between in-group leadership and out-group and no leadership. So which means that an interpretation will be like the shared group identity between an in-group leader and her followers is the strongest. So followers of these in-group leaders take the contribution suggestions of these in-group leaders very, very seriously, at least much, much more seriously than followers of the out-group leaders. Okay, so because they take the contribution suggestions so much seriously, they are making higher contributions to the group account, and that is why the in-group leaders are much more effective than the out-group leaders here. Okay, so that's our first interpretation. Another thing to note here is that there is no statistically significant difference between out-group leadership and no leadership. So from this, we think that the in-group bias here is so strong that the followers are discriminating against the out-group leaders to the extent where there is no difference to having a leader and not having one. So pretty much from here we can see that there is in-group bias from the followers side. We also do a regression analysis. So here I report two random group censored regressions. So the first one includes both the leaders and the followers, and the second one we have only the followers. The numbers in the brackets are the standard errors. So as you can see here, for the in-group leader treatment, I mean, numbers are highly significant. Okay, so it's actually significant at 0.01 level of significance. So that pretty much shows why the in-group leaders are so effective. We also tried to see whether there are any interaction effects between the number of rounds and the leader treatments, but unfortunately we don't find any significance here. Okay. Our second result is the message following behavior. So we have mean absolute deviations from the suggested contributions on the y-axis. So here again, we can see that there's a statistically significant difference between out-group leadership and in-group leadership, meaning that the group members deviate much more from the contribution suggestions made by out-group leaders than in-group leaders. And this is what makes it more challenging for the out-group leaders to be as effective as in-group ones, because if the group members do not really follow the advice, they cannot encourage the group to a more socially better outcome. Okay, so it's a social dilemma. So they are not able to push the people to choose the collective interest over the personal interest. Here also we do a regression analysis, and the dependent variable here is mean absolute deviation from suggested coefficient. So again, we see for the in-group leader treatment, it's highly significant 0.01% level of significance. But unfortunately, again, we don't see any interaction effects between the round and the leader treatments. And finally, our last result, here we see, here we are only focusing on the leaders, okay? So we look at the mean suggested contributions made by the leaders, and we can find that the in-group leaders make statistically higher contribution suggestions to their groups than out-group leaders. And so one interpretation of this will be that it's not only that the followers who exhibit in-group bias, but the leaders themselves are also biased towards their own group members. So when an out-group leader has to lead a group of people who don't belong to his group, they don't identify with that group, then they don't really push that group sufficiently enough to a better outcome. So the so the idea here is it's the discrimination not only comes from the followers side, but also from the leaders side. All right. And again, we do a regression, censored regression analysis here. And the picture is pretty much the same as the regressions that I showed you before. For the in-group leader treatment, we see a very significant, we see the results are highly significant. Okay. So just to wrap up, I would like to say that what our experimental results show is that yes, in-group bias is a challenge for effective leadership. In-group leaders are more likely to suggest greater cooperation, and their suggestions are more likely to be followed. On the other hand, out-group leaders both expect less cooperation, and they also receive less cooperation. All right. And this is a hindrance for all the benefits of diverse leadership that I was talking about at the beginning. Because, you know, like building on a strong shared social identity can mean that equally talented individuals from the minority groups will be ignored, and they will remain underrepresented in leadership positions. And secondly, the ripple effect of having a diverse representation leadership is immense, because one thing is that when there's greater diversity at the top, then there can be, you know, like it can help facilitate a top-down approach. And the greater diversity in leadership can trickle down to other levels of hierarchy. And obviously that's a more desirable outcome. Okay, so we need to look at these challenges which are there for having such diversity in leadership. All right, so that's all. Thank you so much. Any questions?
So Momita, can you hear me? Actually, I have a question. Have you investigated the gender impact in the leadership, like whether the male or female contribute more, or?
No, I haven't done that yet. But we also don't reveal the gender during the experiment. Okay, so there's I mean there might be some impact, but I don't know if because we didn't want the natural social identity like gender to interfere with the artificial identity that we were using in the lab. So that's why we don't make it part of the experimental design. But of course, I have data on that because we asked them the gender in the survey question. So I can probably look if there are any gender effects there. So thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So I have a question.
Yes.
So I think it would be interesting to have a treatment in which you have, for example, a red leader, then one red member, and the other two members from a different color. And see if within the group, the red one, the red participant follows the advice of the leader and the other two do not, even though they're in the same group.
Right. Yes. I thank you for the suggestion. I do think it's a great idea. It also helped me understand if there are any majority, minority division within the followers
Right.
and how much. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you.